George. All right, welcome everyone at the next multi-networking community sync. Today we have May 22nd, and we're gonna continue our discussion about DRA. I think Doug, you have the first bullet, so go ahead.
Okay, cool. Yeah, also related to DRA, but something that continues to come up in these discussions is about the fact that we kind of need something to store the results of some attached network, right? So in the extensions to DRA as proposed by the device management working group, we're seeing some examples for SROV networks, right? I think that a lot of the use of SROV is, of course, highly related to our area. Granted, those are device-specific type of considerations, but you know, related to the use cases that we use. And in fact, I think a lot of the uses that we have in our use cases are related to SROV, even if we call out SRV as a specific one. But at the end of the day, the gist is, okay, so the examples I gave so far, I, I hope to add or have people help me add some stuff specific to our effort and how we cover it, but I was able to put my hands on this quickly and it's out there and people use it, which is we have the network status. It's essentially a CNI Prev result with a little bit of that's essentially what it is, right? Is we're going to tell you what's the interface, what's the IPs we assigned. We have a few extra things that have been added over the years, like MTU was recently added. And so I was trying to put this as a use case, right? So not to say like, hey, we offer this feature, but there are use cases that require this. And at least the one I'm the most familiar with is essentially when you go to provision your workload, you might need to know this information so you could configure that workload properly. So I tried to put that in there as a like use case and then give this example of how it looks today. So my hope is here that we could kind of flesh this out and then start a discussion about it and share it with that group. And I guess also from the perspective of this group is, you know, this is something that we've really already kind of considered. And yeah, what do we expect as an outcome here? How can we solve this? Is there something that we're missing? Etc. So I wanted to try to push this convo along a little bit.
Right. I think one comment from my side is, I think to show what we were thinking, at least from the point of view of the CAP that we discussed last year, right? Where I think we were proposing the cloud native approach. What you have here, let me maybe find an example for that, was to basically add a field in the pod spec, right? Pod status. But then slightly limited in terms of where do I have this guy? I think I did updated it. Slightly limited in terms of amount of data you provided, right? Because it was just supposed to be just extension of the IPs field, right? So maybe I will put that there in the doc. Let me try to find that enhancement. So this is something that let's keep in mind of what we were proposing for the we had post attachment status was supposed to be here. Yeah, there it is. Got it. And I have added, can I add it here? Let me just.
Please and thank you. Awesome.
maybe this way. Okay, so maybe not the best way to paste it, but I can do this. Give me a sec. Just not really. Um, oh, there you go. So basically what it ended up being is to have a networks field. Apparently we cannot change pod IPs. This is breaking the kind of API, so we cannot add anything here. The assumptions to the pods IP field is it can have only at most 2 IPs, each from separate IP family. So I think this one is a no-go. This is what I heard. This is what's defined in the API description of the API. So the proposal was to create a field called networks, and that would have the data, basically replication of what was supposed to be here, right? So the name, interface name, what was the finally used values, right? For those, this is spec expected. What did you got, right? So basically, that was supposed to be the approach for this, right? Maybe do one more thing if I can, so that we don't have the divide. Okay. I think that was the approach from the CAP, right? Maybe let me add that. And one aspect for this is it didn't have definitely and couldn't have all of this, right? Because those are like MAC address, right? Or routes. Those are very specific to multi-networking, and that's why we thought, I'm not sure whether that's applicable to be here. The IP is something that is used by others, but not the other ones. I'm not sure whether that was the correct approach or not, but I think that was the minimalist, the MVP approach that we were initially wanted to kind of go for. That's where I want to kind of set the stage around this one in terms of, since this was a core object, everyone were to use it, this has to be some generic only data, not more specific for multi-networking. And the question would be whether that be sufficient. I know there are use cases for using this, but yeah, that was the consensus we made back then. Any comments to this? I have a question to you, Doug. You mentioned this is you mentioned this can be used by the downward API. The downward API can pass annotations.
Yep.
Is that true? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a pretty common way that people use it. And I mean, I would say that having some results is better than no results. So like I'm definitely willing to make concessions there, but it also makes me ask the question. So this is the like history with Network Plumbing Working Group is that we've extended the number of fields there over the years. So it makes me wonder if in some cases we need like a pointer to say like, oh, get the rest of the information from here or something like that.
Right.
Although the other thing I'm like painfully aware of too is it's like something that seems to be happening a bit here in this space is that we add layers and layers and layers of abstraction and different things you need to touch. It's outside of all of the other dirty things about net attached stuff, at the end of the day, it is pretty easy in terms of what you have to do in Kubernetes. Make an annotation and create a custom resource. Barring the fact that you have to know how to create a CNI config, right? Which is a barrier to usage, but yeah, so those are things that are on my mind about it. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think that my main thing is to have an organized set of thoughts, which this is becoming, and your addition of this is great, so that we can let the folks in the device management working group know, like
What
these
sort of stuff
results
we need?
are
Yeah.
important. Yeah.
And that's fair, right? And they one aspect that I want to call out, this is a list, right? So it contains all whatever the pod contains, right? Everything in one place. That's something that I was pushing back recently, but last week I kind of realized maybe that's not a big issue. Why I was, maybe just give you more context, why I was pushing for that. I was under the impression that, let's say that a thing like endpoint slice controller has to watch all the pods to kind of realize and do the services, right? And the watch, I thought, will be expensive if there is much more objects to watch. But and the expensiveness comes from the amount of events being sent by the API server. But considering there's only one controller doing this whole thing, and the events are being sent between just the controller and API server, this is not so expensive. So this is where I kind of realized last week something like that. So having to have everything in one place is not the biggest, I think, problem here, which in opposition to what I was initially thinking. The having them spread, and this is where I'm kind of heading towards probably the DRA discussion more. Having the statuses spread across, let's assume, a claim probably can be good enough. And scale wise, I don't think that will be a bigger concern. Yes, Pete.
So the worry I have here is that the great thing about annotations is you can use the downward API. And so the application can get hold of information about its network interfaces. And that's a thing we quite often have to do. And there's often, particularly in kind of tedious DPDK type cases, you get into situations where an application doesn't have any way of making network connections until it's learned some information about its own network interfaces, and therefore it can't talk to the API server. And so just here's some JSON on disk that you can look at is great. And so that's a use case that's really important for a lot of things we do.
That's fair, yes. And I assume, because I'm trying to, I think, transition toward what the DRA could look like, the approach. But before I go and move there, any other comments to this? I think, Doug, we probably can add about what I'm going to talk about, the piece about the statuses for DRA. But beside that, is that kind of what else? Well, what do you want to do with this doc next, Doug?
So I guess here's the thing is I would love anyone to contribute any sort of ideas or use cases to it. I think what I will do is I will bring this to the device management working group this coming Tuesday. And just bring it up as for discussion to hear what folks think. I don't think that it needs a ton of extra information here, but if anyone wants to jot down use cases, like Pete, I'm gonna put something in there about the like user space networking. I think that's a great example.
Yeah.
And I think I've seen the same thing a number of times too. So I'll add that. But I mostly wanted to make folks in that effort aware of this. I'm guessing this is probably the kind of thing that they will think of as a phase 2, is my guess. But the earlier we let them know, the better. And also, I just wanted to help collect our thoughts here within this group, which the rest of those thoughts might go under the next bullet point in the agenda, which is just the
Right.
RA as a headline. But this was a very, to me, rather tangible thing that we could address.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. So I think last week we had yes, Lana.
Just a question about this use case document, because there is the DRA use case document where I wrote a little bit about the the status, and there was some comments about it, but I'm wondering if this is just an extension or more descriptive use cases.
I think we can combine those, right?
Yeah, no, we can definitely. Sorry, Lionel, that I didn't. I should have a pointer in this doc to that. I mostly what I wanted to do is have it outside of that doc to start the conversation before this was totally solidified. But I appreciate that you had that in there, and I may have actually missed that you put it in there. But
Yeah,
I just
there are
wanted to
some
get into.
snippets. So I think that what can happen this can be more detailed because the status piece is just one of the things that Lionel listed out, and basically you can then pass this link to this doc about more details about the status.
And
That's how
another
we can
comment
do it.
also, in this use case document about the array, they put a new table where they ask us to fill this table with our use cases. Should we fill it? Last
Yeah,
week we were
definitely we
saying,
can. We probably
okay.
can do that and look at it. Yeah, definitely. Let me see that. This is where did I had it? I think that was here.
I shared it in the chat if you want.
Yeah, I got it. Share this doc. This guy, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think someone, I don't remember, John asked us to fill
Yeah,
this table with our use cases.
let's read through those and see whether let's do that offline. I'm not saying now, but if folks can add something, yeah, let's do that. I see there is a bunch of VF stuff related, but yeah, let's see whether we can add some multi-networking use cases as well. All right, yeah,
Sure.
that's fair. Let's update this.
Yeah,
So anything else, Lionel?
no, nothing else. Thanks.
All right. So what I wanted to talk about is kind of a bit of a brainstorm on, and basically want to do it here. I don't have anything else, but on what?
Just sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You wanted to mention about the status in the array in the document.
Right. I basically I want to start from this and then.
Okay.
Yeah, I will trickle down to that one. Yes, I will. But I want to start from this because basically, I'm not sure how many of you folks are on the device management working group mailing list. Team sent out an email. He's kind of seeing trying to separate the kind of problems, divide them into two separate problems: the user facing piece, and then basically the claims and enumeration as a separate. And he feels that maybe whatever is currently in 130, we should just go with that. Having said that, what does that mean is the array is happening. That we know all of that one, right? And the question to us is, do we want to ride on it? Do we assume that something that multi-networking should just concede? And I'm seeing concede because it's geometric. It's completely different to what, maybe not completely, but it's different to what we initially kind of discussed and designed in this group. Or do we want to push back something that we talked last week, that no, we find that CUJ is completely like out of scope and out of like user experience to what we expect multi-network should be, and it's a no-go. So this is, I would like to kind of come to that decision today. So before we do that, I would like to see and basically revisit to what I think Lionel did the demo, right? So this is should be our kind of base of the of the discussion of what can it be. So maybe I just wanted to draw of what does that mean. So and simply put it, how the APIs would look like, right? What we do, what we reference, and how that's kind of how that will feel. So this is what I want to kind of focus on today, to kind of see if that's something that we are okay with or not. And this is where I want to kind of eventually get to the status and basically how the other pieces would work. So what we have our pod, and Lionel managed to do a demo of pod referencing a device claim, and then that through a CRD referencing something else. So basically that will be, and I want to just kind of to draw this out, right? So we have here, and Lionel, please keep me honest here. We will have a, let's say we will have a claim template here. So basically pod references a claim template. And what I want to call out, this is how will be the, this will be the user, let's say manifest, right? Stage, right? So basically what the user creates, user manifests wherever they have to do, right? So they have to create a pod. Pod has to reference a claim template, which then through a CRD has to reference, let me just copy paste that, which then has to reference a pod network. You were referencing just network NAD, network attachment definition, and use Multus, but what I'm trying to kind of propose here, what if we were to create a pod network, which is a CRD? So think gateway API stuff approach, right? That gives us like the free kind of free hand to do whatever we want, by the way. Free hand on what is inside pod network. We probably will have to revisit what's from start with what we kind of decided on what we want to do, but then we can revisit because it's then clearly and purely multi-networking, and it can have other fields that we deem correct. Of course, with this approach, we assume, at least the one take from the core here, that we can have the kubelet piece to use this path for all the networks that we want to use, not the CNI, of course, right? So this is something that has to be discussed on how that can happen, but this is the assumption I'm making here that, okay, the one thing that we get from the core out of this whole thing is that when I define a claim template with pod network in it, I can skip my CNI and the whole networking is done through this. And then I can as well update at least the default network's status of the pod, right? What happens here next is this guy then references to example, and I'm gonna sit on network attachment, network attachment. So basically, this is what will be the kind of path to this, right? So let me just draw this up. And I know this is exactly to what we all discussed about. I just had to create the 2 objects. Now I have to create 4, or maybe I had to create just 1 object, network attachment definition. Now I have to create 2 more, right? So this is the manifest that we will have to define, right? That's one aspect, but there is another aspect to this, which is the runtime piece. And this is where I want to kind of trickle in the so after I do this and apply that, there is the runtime phase. So what happens in runtime phase? There is no pod claim. There is a claim, and let me just some hash. So there is a claim created, and Lionel, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the case, right? I think that if I have a template, it will create some claim which is specifically for that interface or that claim, right? And that pod. So this is one-to-one mapping, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's what I was assuming. And basically that claim in some ways points to the CRD and the network definition, right? So basically what I'm saying, this guy then holds the status, right? So what we would want to get from the work group on the other hand. So core was about the kubelet and making sure that CNI versus this can work. And then from the work group, we would want to have a ability to what just was discussed. The status would be here, right? And this will be along the lines of what just we discussed about the status of how this could really happen, right? So the question would be, is that acceptable or not, right? Because now the status is now in claim. Pete called out that then we cannot do download API. That's true, we cannot, right? It's all at the next stage is that it will be spread across multiple claims for pods. So I need to find the matching. And to be honest, I don't even know how they are paired. Lionel, do you know? Is there a status on the pod, or do you have to just loop through all the claims and find the one that points to pod? Do you know how that works?
I think you have a status of which claim are allocated for your pod, but you don't. You only have like the name of the claim, and then in the claim itself, it's not totally defined yet. I think. I think it's
Okay.
only the allocation part, so the scheduling part that is in the status for now, not
Okay.
the configuration part.
Okay. So basically, what I'm saying here as well is here, this is all us, and we control the CUJ and how that's configured, right? Whatever we deem as a group, however the CRD will look like, that's on us. And basically the conditions are there as well. The status, the availability, whatever we kind of had in the cap, that's preserved. The default network, the availability of those, because then through that there will be a controller that will control this, and in some ways will control as well the claim, because it can then deem the claim being not ready or ready, right? And this is something that another aspect we will have to look at, whether we can control that in some ways, right? Why we want to do that is because we want to ensure this pod doesn't start unless this guy is ready, right? So pod network has to be ready before I even start the pod. The scheduler should say, oh, the claim is not ready, or I don't have the resource for this, right? So this is how can that be done through, because if I'm not mistaken, claims are based on number of resources. So we can say until this network is not ready, the number of resources available across the cluster is 0. And then when each node becomes ready, you can even do that per node availability. That's kind of good, because then you can say, oh, this node finally catch up, understands the network, and can report I have so many resources for that pod network for that claim, right? Template. And that's how we can even control the scheduler and do all that around, right? So no more mutating webhook around this. Then when this network is ready for the specific node, this is when we finally allow you, okay, you go and schedule your pods, right? So kind of this is the kind of the story that we designed last year would fit with this today, right? We still have the pod network. We will still define the default one. One aspect to this that probably we will have to come up in this project, we will have to come up with the mutating webhook to post a pod with a default claim if you don't specify anything, to kind of fit in the story that we think that the whole networking should be done through that, right? So we will have to have that mutating webhook for that single piece, right? When I don't specify anything, we will push that mutation to the pod spec, right? To always call out that, okay, I'll always have to have the default even if I don't specify anything. Yes, Lion.
Are you talking about the default network, right?
Right.
But we need to be able to disable the CNI then.
And yeah, this is where all that piece I am putting under the umbrella of the kubelet changes. This is the ask we would have from the core with this approach, that we want to ensure that the core doesn't mess us up and allows us to have all the networks done through this path, right? And then the same ways it can report the status for the pod the same path, right? Even if that just means that we create our own in this project. And this is, keep in mind, this is what I'm thinking here. When you think about Gateway API today, there is a separate repository. They have their own stuff in the Kubernetes org, right? So this will be in Kubernetes. So this will be GitHub. Let me think. Kubernetes, and let's say we will have multi-network repository, right? So all this will be in all this will be in this repository, right? All that will be here, so that we can do whatever we want, right? No, not exactly, right? It has to be structured. It has to be agreed upon. Same like Gateway API does it, right? But then what I'm getting at, we have a more free reign of what we want to do, right?
I mean,
we don't have to.
To mention about improvement of DRA, we could propose to have default object in every pod, maybe. Like if you want to have a GPU for every single pod in your cluster, you could specify it in a kubelet parameter, maybe. This would be possible.
That's a fair point. Yeah, Lionel. Yeah, I agree. We could then mix around that one. Yeah, and thanks for the idea. Exactly. We don't have to do that. But what I'm getting at is high level now, because I don't want to go into every detail. And thank you, Lionel. Yeah, we need those eventually, but high level. And to make the decision of, is that the path we are okay to take? And what I'm saying is, this is conceding from what we initially thought it should be. And the alternative to this is, we are saying it's not available, it's not for us. We want a proper networking representation in core. And that will be probably will push us another year or so, because DRA is on top of minds for everyone. And nobody's gonna try to now introduce another complexity level and discussions and try to kind of put more kind of attention to something that's not DRA. So I think the trade-offs is, we use this and integrate with DRA the way it is, with such use case CUJ that we have here, or we say, no, let's wait out the DRA and then come back with something that is more along the lines that we had initially thought of. And now the floor, because we need to kind of decide here to kind of what side, how we would want to, where we would want to go with this. Any comments?
I guess I would say, it's a tough spot for this group, because so here's my take on it is, all right, so if we look at Gateway as an example, and it's sort of the like poster child of Kate's community for having a good process to get there. They started as CRDs, made their way into core. They now have this extension process with the GEPs. It's a really nice model.
Keep in
So-
mind, there is no that they and Shane, correct me if I'm wrong. There is nothing in core regarding Gateway API.
Okay, all right. So
And
there's
Shane,
nothing.
you here? Is that correct?
That's right. Yep, that's right.
Okay,
We've
okay.
decided to keep it out of core.
Yeah.
Okay,
There is.
all right. So that is a little different. But the feeling that I've had is that folks have looked at this group and said, this should be a CRD first. And it's a tough pill to swallow for this group, because for 7 years, we have had a CRD outside of core, which is the network attachment definition.
Yeah.
So that seems like it doesn't make sense to us. However, there's part of me that says, if we start this as a CRD first and people see the value in it, can we make a better case for getting into core? I also think there's this other aspect to it, like you said, Mache. There's a lot of oomph behind DRA. It has the 4 letters AIML next to the use case, and those 4 letters get you a lot of attention. So for good reasons, right? So that's going to happen. Folks are going to start using it. If we don't have an association with it, I think that that's a tough spot for us right now. So I think we need to look there, and the bottom line is the examples do cover a like multi-networking use case with, you know, device specific stuff like SROB.
So on that note, just to interject, VFs are going to be used done through DRA, right? But then we can make a case that it will be the same as device plugins, right? Where what we do today with network attachment definition and SRV, right? The management of the hardware is done through device plugin or DRA, but the networking for it is then done through slightly different means, right? So this is another aspect of this whole thing, right? How we integrate another argument maybe for using this, what I'm showing here, so that it's because it's then consistent, right? So, yeah, sorry.
No, that's good. And I mean, it generally just I think that's the general gist of where I'm at, which is we're in kind of a tough spot here. If we take the CRD approach, we can kind of move forward in our own right. And then we look at the possibility of how to move towards core. And yeah, and maybe look at how to solve some of these problems of we went from a one object to three kind of a thing. Like that's it's just that is a downer because it was really I was hoping for something else. And then from my own perspective and own needs, I really want to see some like oomph behind how do we get the stuff that are the big gaps with network attachment definition, like services, right? Or service-like functionality using Gateway API, network policy, all of that good stuff. And then Mache, I know that one of your important use cases was on the multi-tenancy and having like different primary networks per group of pods, for example, right? So we're kind of not getting that sort of stuff. So I sort of feel like there are among this group, there's a number of us that do have considerations that we might not be able to get this DRA group to cover. Like, I don't think they're going to care so much about services for secondary networks.
So, so to kind of interject to what you were saying, in terms of my stuff, if we were to use this for all the networks, I'm covered for multi-tenancy, right? Because some pods just connect to defaults by default. If I specify just one network, I connect just that one network. So my multi-tenancy is there. In terms of the service, if we define this object in Kubernetes multi-network, I think we can talk with Shane to have this guy, this pod network defined here to be referenced inside Gateway API. Of course, needs discussion, what's not, but at least we can start proposing something that's a CRD inside this org that can be referenced, right? This is, I assume, Shane, this was semi-acceptable, right? And I don't want to put
Catch me
words.
with it one more time.
If we were to support services, the one that Dax is referring to, right? Our idea was to always go to something that I was referring to last week, to use Gateway APIs for service, L4 services. Use Gateway APIs for it, right? And basically then we could be able to reference in somewhere in the Gateway API or in the routes, the pod network, if it's part of this repository, imaginary repository.
I would have to give that some thought.
Definitely, yes. So that's something that has to be thought out on what does that mean, because
yeah, do you have time to write that up in a discussion on the Gateway API repo saying like this is the way in which we intend to use Gateway, or that we're thinking about using Gateway? Because I think that could definitely use some discussion, and I could certainly need some time to think about that.
Yeah, definitely. But what I'm getting at is this is something that we can stand.com, go to that group with some concrete, CRD. It will be a tough sell if you want to kind of interject and I'm talking about like changing the spec, not annotation, because annotation you can just do whatever, right? I'm talking about like having ability to change a spec to say call out this guy is on a pod network X, right? Of course, this is not a core object, but something that we maybe can work out to do something right about that. So this is where then the services kind of story is. We can move along that, right? That there is a definitely bunch of work behind that. Because, for example, like Service-Sider is fully integrated into the core, which is annoying, and that has to be disconnected, right? But then we have a push to the core team to say, you wanted us outside of core, then make sure everything can be outside of core, because right now, like, service side is baked in there, right? And we want to have our own control over that. So that's something that we will push back then and go to that group to kind of to ensure that they can untangle that crap. But then we will have, you didn't want us in core, so please appease us, right? In that way, right? So that's another aspect. But then we can probably achieve the services through that, right? And have a better story around going to gateway API folks to kind of, okay, we have this CRD, which is in org, right? And can we just reference it that way, right? With some proper story behind how that's going to be used and all around it, right? And then the other use case was, and it's something that I recently learned for network policy, this is the same story. Apparently there is a V2 version of network policies, which is a CRD again in the org, in the Kubernetes org. And the same story can be repeated, right? Can we have just a pod network, which is that, be referenced over there, right? And instead of using the core network policy, just use that CRD. Same like gateway. And then we cover the network policies feature and the services feature with that. What do you think, Doug, about that kind of a strategy around this? Because that's kind of, I'm tiptoeing around core. I think that's what it boils down to.
Oh, I
Yeah,
hate
no,
the
that-
tiptoeing around core.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that because I have to admit it's like easy to feel gun shy where it's like there hasn't been a lot of ideas that coming from core about how we can get our way in there, and mostly just what to me feels like a series of no with
Yeah.
hand raising, hand waving, but that's an emotionally biased statement, I have to admit. But I mean, I certainly like the idea of working with the Gateway API group to figure out how this can happen. I think that's great. I do think that even if we are taking a CRD approach in this group, I think that we have a lot of common interests amongst folks here. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Any other comments? Because I think having all those paths on how we can enable some of the features, and I think let's see on, because that's a fair point. Let me save this. This is going to be in the notes, if anything. Let me get back to go over our requirements that we had initially for multi-networking. Let's see, this is use cases here. Share this tab. So this is the requirements that I'm not sure whether that's large enough, or let me maybe zoom a bit. What we were thinking to have based on other use cases that we drew up. So should not change behavior. Yeah, that's kind of covered. Represent implicit API construct. So that's out of the window. Yeah, so this is where the decouples implementation from consumer. So I think this is where we will have that, right? Because pod network object will still be there. No implementation specific stuff. So basically definition about pod network, this will still be applicable. And then default pod network, I think we will be able to achieve that as well. How it behaves, we need to kind of define that better. So I think reference by multiple pods can reference one or multiple pod networks, that will be there. Specifying reference. Okay, so this is the default network handling, to have it always there referenced. What shall have? Yeah, so this is extra configuration, like reference to the network attachment definition, right? So that will be still preserved. This is basically connectivity. And on this point, since we are outside of core, 13 might not be the case, right? It's good to have, but then since we are outside of core, we can define that, right? Whether within a specific pod network, you have the connectivity or you do not. And then this one still applies as well of cross connectivity between pod networks. Pod attached to pod. Yeah, this is basically how we attach, and that's defined by the implementation. Okay, this is something that we will not be able to do. This is the downward API stuff, right? Interface information, right? So this part, I think number 17 is something we will not be able to satisfy, because now this whole thing is in the claims. This whole status is in completely outside of pod spec. So I don't think we can downward API reference anything else beside pod object? Anyone knows? Is there any precedence on that, or that's only pod object?
With CDI, you can modify the environment variable.
Okay, there
of
you
the
go.
container.
So basically,
But
we could do that.
I'm not sure if you can after the configuration of the network. I have to check that.
Okay, so maybe we have some ways to do that. We did mention environmental variables, but we always thought that a download API will be the approach, right? Provide access control. Okay, access control. This is something that will have to be done with some, as I mentioned, like for example, I think that's how the DRA does. This is something I learned recently. DRA does access control by allowing a specific namespace or a pod, giving them quota, and basically based on that, you have quota, then you can use the resource. So you don't have quotas, then you cannot, right? So I think based on that, we can do as well access control. Initially we were thinking about doing some sort of a attached verb in the RBAC system, but I think the additional quota thing that the array has probably can satisfy us the control, right? So I think, yeah, those are good. The environmental variable, if we can do that with what you, Lionel, what you said, then we are covered. And then here, probing. So I think this is connectivity, right? About the pod, right? So this is something that I wonder whether we can achieve. Same goes with the two next ones, API access to pod network attachments and vice versa, right? So how do I connect those two? Maybe this is just up to the implementation, how they kind of forward the traffic to the API. And this is the multi-tenancy aspect what I'm referring to. If I have a pod attached to a non-default network only, so how that's going to be behaving, right? And the last one, I think we discussed about the service network policy. I see a path to enable those things. Something that we could maybe leverage exactly the other CRDs to kind of do this. So I think we are covered 100% here in terms of like requirements to that DRA approach. Other thoughts?
Before we had more requirements, for example, update and attachment on the running pod. I think I mean, in some DRA document I read about that. It's in place pod resource update, for example. So this.
Oh, so I think we. I see what you're saying. Update ability. I think we did mention. I think hot plug, was that mentioned here, or that was removed?
No, you removed it to simplify the cap.
Yeah, I think we got rid of that to simplify the cap. So this is something that then we can, because it's a CRD and we have more control. So this is something that we can definitely revisit to add. I think maybe before we go there, I think this will be the first things that we would have to address, and let's focus. And I would prefer focusing on those. What you're saying, Lionel, this is, I think, the phase 4 and future, right? To see of that. Definitely, because we can expand, right? Building on top of whatever we come.
But yeah, but
I think,
just to mention that in DRA, I read something about that. Like you can.
Oh, they will have that.
Sources. Yeah,
okay.
I'm not sure if they will, but I read about that.
And even better, then maybe we would get it for free. Then there's that. Some gain from that based on the discussion. So Any thoughts? Anyone else having some thoughts about this approach? Let me share this back.
What will be the countable object in the DRA? I mean, what is the device plugin counting?
IP, the simplest.
So IP address will be a countable object.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, I agree. I was checking with. So that means that the DHCP or something, you could run out of an IP on one node, and then you will place the pod on another node where
And
you still have.
Not only, because keep in mind that you can have something called global IPAM. If you think whereabouts, right? You can do global. So then you have globally resource, right? And then the question would be how.
But then routing
how
will be
you
a mess.
account for that, right?
Yeah. How would you set up routing in a system where you have like no structure of the addresses?
Sorry, I'm confused. What do you mean?
If you have a system where any IP address can end up on any pod, you need to like have like a routing entry for each pod.
So that part is, I think you're calling out some implementation details now, and this is even implementation. Now, but even this is like more of an implementation side of things. Of if you do global IPAM, like today, let's just quickly. It's usually L2. It's usually Mac VLAN. And you're in the same VLAN for the same for whereabouts, right? So this is where you can then move around. You don't care about where you at. You can use anything, right? But and that's how you do. But this is implementation specific, I would find. But I think to means to what will be the accountable thing for this. For if it's a VF, SRV or what's not. It's straightforward. We have the VF's number, right? But if it's just a standard,
it can be many things. This is the thing. That's what I was thinking about. That maybe from this claim we need to break down into like resources that are countable.
Right, because and this is where we could give more. I think this is where I was one of the use cases where maybe your resource doesn't have to be an IP, and I'm bringing an IP because this is the easiest. But if you want to go further, you can expand the controller that for your implementations for you to the resource to be a bandwidth, for example. I don't know, maybe that's a simple example, right? You have a bandwidth of 1 gig for the parent interface, and you should not over provision that 1 gig, right? You want to do that, and that's just a one simple alternative to the IP. There probably are other cases that you could make, but one of them, right? And basically, this is where the implementations, on the other hand, can go crazy. I think from that point of view, this is where we need to allow that.
We could have multiple countable objects, and then we could like define the claims in such a way that you would place the pod where all those requirements are fulfilled, I guess.
And basically, this is where this is another aspect of this is something that I heard from the DRA aspect. Is that something that I think NVIDIA wants to do? So they want to do similar aspects like we do here. And if I'm not mistaken, the claim has to point to a class eventually. I think this is what I'm drawing up down here is not fully representative. And what the CRD does, it basically the controller, based on the parameters of that CRD, it will create the class with the proper parameters. So this is where you can do your logic, right? I want to have a class, and for this claim that has to have one IP available, this bandwidth, this device, etc.
Yeah, cool.
So basically, this gives you more flexibility. I'm trying to see what
I really like the idea of the DRA, because that is the way that you will become model driven, like everything else should be in Kubernetes, I think.
Yeah, maybe that's another path. So I think, Doug, I assume I managed to convince you in some ways. I know this is not the best, but I think you are semi-convinced that this might be a path forward.
No, I think that this is the way forward for the time being. Yeah.
Other folks, because right now I think this is we are not going to push back on the pod network as a core. I think this is the kind of the proposal that we can move forward, and the other aspects will be just to ensure that yes, we can make sure that we need to ensure the kubelet can use default network and not intervene with the default CNI. And then in the DRA, we need to talk about the status, how we can plug that in. So those are the two things we definitely need from the core. Probably some others. What Lionel, you mentioned about the default object to be passed. That's awesome. If we could maybe pass on that one, that would be great as well. Any other comments, folks? I think this is where we are kind of on a crossroad, and we want to take a path towards one. So silence means approval. That's how I'm taking it.
What would be the next step?
So the next step is to drive, I think, to come up maybe more detailed approach for this. What would that really mean? And what we really mean from and need from the core, right? If we were to do this path. I think we can definitely, our cap will be just moved out from the core, and we'll just need to kick off our Kubernetes multi-network repository, where we can start building things, right? We can start the pod network CRD to have something, and then work with the kind of create some POCs around the kubelet integration, and then the DRA integration in terms of the status, right? I think this is the only thing we need from DRA, ability to provide our status here to do some of this, right? All right, I think this will be the path forward. I will try to kind of create a doc with more detail design around this one, and then we can. What we need to do is, I think tomorrow we have a SIG network. We can show this tomorrow at that. I will try to maybe select that. That's what we think how we can integrate, and then what we would need from the core, and what's the possibility around that one, right? All right, I think we have a path forward on this one. We can move on, I think, with getting something enabled eventually.
Yeah, good.
All right.
I'm glad we made that decision. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Let me start recording and